especially ages 18 to 24, a lot of them do not have or have not been given the access to resources to develop certain skills that will allow them to compete for jobs above an entry-level position, especially here in Washington, D.C. So through partnership with Brother Ferrate and other D.C. organizations, what we've been able to do was bring this Caribbean fusion concept to D.C. and employ our youth and train them through culinary arts and hospitality on customer relations. We have 2 young people who are back there as part of the program. They're learning customer relations and public speaking by being here and speaking to you and engaging you, building their confidence. They're learning procedures and policies and problem solving by preparing food. The food that you're eating, they prepare. So they're learning, okay, if something goes wrong, how do we handle it? What is the professional way to handle it? They're learning all types of skills that are transferable from culinary arts and hospitality to other fields. And what happens is when you order from us, like when you have these meals here today, or you order from us for other events or for the Fusion Bowls at lunch, those proceeds, those funds go towards salaries to be able to bring more young people into the program and train them, as well as green pantries and other incentives that they need. There's no secret that Ward 7 and 8 are food deserts where there's not a lot of access to a wide variety of fresh fruits and vegetables. So being able to teach them about mango, and we do pineapple chutneys and with tamarind and avocado aiolis and different variations of foods, it shows them that just because you've had a fruit or vegetable or a dish one way and you didn't like it doesn't mean that you write off that entire food or vegetable, that you could prepare it a different way. Food is a conversation. And so with the Green Pantry and the other incentives, we're able to not only have them learn to prepare that food, but they're also able to go and take that food home free of charge to their families and their community, so that they're not only eating well, but their families and communities eating well. Because the truth is, if our families and communities eating well, then 5 to 10 years from now, they will be healthier. One thing that we always talk about is financial literacy, but the truth is it doesn't make sense to make a whole lot of money now and then spend it all out in your latter years on healthcare because you did not take care of your body. So if we teach our young people now to eat well, to eat a wide variety, and to have fun with your food, then when they're at our age or older and they're holding these positions, they're in a position of empowerment. They understand their knowledge and they have the health to go out and be upstanding citizens. So I thank you for this time. If you have any questions, we are in the back and we hope you enjoy your food. Thank you.
So I thought that I would give my distinguished colleague an opportunity to finish the delicious food. And so I would go first, not to mention the fact that she has a really pretty PowerPoint. And so I don't want to go after her. I will go first. I didn't do a PowerPoint because I thought that, for what it's worth, I would put this whole aspect of the law into the light of the tax incentive that it is. And so that's sort of why I'm here. You may have heard of the New Markets Tax Credit. You may have heard of the Low-Income Tax Credit. So what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did was it added a new chapter to the tax code right alongside those. And it is a tax incentive, so that it does not only benefit them, and there's nothing wrong with folks doing things that benefit themselves, but in a way that sort of benefits others. How can everybody benefit from sort of pent-up capital in a way that doesn't feel like a zero-sum game? So that's the motive behind this law. And the first way that the law seeks to achieve that is to say that you won't pay capital gains taxes for a while if you put that capital into an opportunity zone. So again, that's layman's terms. So most people in the room probably know what capital gains are, what that means. But just to be clear, just to start with our vocabulary, if you own a stock, if you own a house that you rent out that isn't your primary residence, and you sell it, then you have ideally a capital gain. Now, of course, you might have sold it at a loss, in which case you have a capital loss. Right. But a capital asset is, in most cases, some piece of real property or some financial security. And if you buy an Amazon stock for $1 and you sell it 5 years later for $5, then you have a capital gain of $4, 5 minus 1. So there are, studies have shown that there are people in this world who have lots and lots of money, and to the tune of billions of dollars, I believe there are considered to be of pent up capital gains. And the idea is, how do we get people to liquidate some of those assets and hand them over and invest them into an opportunity zone? And so that's sort of the genesis, the birth of this statute. And so the first way to benefit from the tax incentive that's built into the statute is to liquidate a capital asset and to, within 180 days, reinvest it into a zone that has been designated by a governor of a state, or in the situation of DC, Mayor Muriel Bowser, whose representative is here. Invested in a zone. So then how do you do that? The way to do that is to invest it in a fund. So the corollary to the qualified opportunity zones is the idea of a qualified opportunity fund. And the fund is a company that someone has established and that abides within the strict guidelines that allows that company to qualify as you're going to hear the word qualified a million times tonight, right? Because that's what the Q stands for: qualified opportunity zones, qualified business property, qualified opportunity fund. Everything has to be qualified, because the qualified means that it has abided within and sort of confined itself to the rules. The fund is a company that, in a nutshell, has substantially all of its assets invested in a qualified zone. So now we take it a step back. You had an investor who had a piece of property that was worth, $50 million, and perhaps he inherited it from his grandfather, and when his grandfather, acquired the property, it was worth $1, right? So if this investor today were to sell that piece of land, which he doesn't really need, he would earn $50 million. Sounds like a good day, except that then there's going to come a pretty hefty tax bill if you sell a piece of property for $50 million that you acquired for practically nothing. So we now want to incentivize that person to not just sit on the property because he doesn't want to sell it just to avoid paying the taxes, but to sell it, then to give those funds to give those dollars to a qualified opportunity fund. And if he does that, then he won't pay taxes right now on the $50 million that he otherwise would have needed to pay taxes on. So that's the basic transaction here, is that you liquidate a capital asset, you give it to a qualified fund, and you allow the fund to invest it in a qualified zone. And if you do that, then you won't pay taxes on the asset that you liquidated for up to 10 years. So the idea is for these investors to give their funds over to a fund that is going to operate in a zone, and that you leave it there, right? We're not interested in, because the distressed zones are not going to benefit as much for somebody who gives the money and says, well, I want it back next year, I want it back in 18 months. So the idea is for people to invest in a fund and to leave it in the fund for up to 10 years. And if they leave the money in the fund for up to 10 years, then during that entire 10 years, they won't pay the capital gains tax on the property that they sold in the first place. So that's basically 10 years of no taxes on the thing that you sold at a profit. So earlier I said that there were 2 tax benefits built into the law. So that's the first one, is that if you liquidate a capital asset and you give it to a qualified fund that invests it in a qualified zone, that then you don't pay a capital gains tax on the capital asset that you sold. The second tax incentive is what happens when the money is sitting in the fund's hands. So you've heard of mutual funds, you've heard of private equity funds, you've heard of hedge funds. The idea of a qualified opportunity fund, you can think of it as belonging to that same category, because this fund is going to have a person sitting in the captain's seat who's going to determine what to do with that money. And that person is going to invest it in a way that qualifies and that adheres to the rules of the qualified opportunity zone, sort of chapter of the statute. But at the end of the day, you're entrusting those funds to the fund. In the same way that if you have any sort of 401k or IRA or anything, and in it are ETFs or mutual funds or any of that stuff, well, there's a fund manager that has determined which stocks have been put together to comprise that mutual fund. And you're trusting that person, and you check your account balance every so often. but it's not up to you, really, what companies are invested in, that kind of thing. So there's a similar concept in the sense that when you give funds over to a qualified opportunity fund, you're entrusting the managers, the investors, to do with it what is smart. Because the whole idea is for you not just to do something that benefits that zone, but earlier I said there's nothing wrong with doing something for your own benefit, so the idea is that your investment will appreciate. So that's the second tax benefit, is that the funds, the monies that you give to the funds are in and of themselves, so that you don't pay taxes on that. And there again, if you leave it there for 10 years. So presumably, you're gonna leave the monies in the fund for 10 years. So the analogy here is if you buy a house and you have a renter in that house, at the end of 10 years, you're hoping that the house will have appreciated in value, because you might want to sell it in 10 years, and hopefully the house is worth more in 10 years than when you bought it. Also, during the 10 years, hopefully the rent that you get from somebody in there is going to help you pay the mortgage or to just have a bit of extra pocket money, right? So there's an asset that's paying sort of to you, and that's also appreciating in value. So you can think of your investment in a fund in the same way. You get to put money into the fund, and the fund in and of itself is supposed to generate profits. And to the extent that you would get paid out of the fund, then there's income that you would earn while your money is sitting in the fund. But also at the end of 10 years, ideally the fund itself will be worth more than when you put it in there. So that's sort of a general overview. There's lots of technical sort of aspects to it. But I want to pause there and just really open it up for any questions that anybody may have, because I know that when it comes to tax law, the analogies aren't always that clear. Question?
So after 10 years, what is your tax obligation? So say you put money into a fund, you sell your portion of the fund, do you have to pay taxes then after 10 years? Or?
You will have to pay taxes to the extent that you would have when you sold property to put it in the fund.
It really just deferred your tax obligations.
That's one piece of it, is a 10-year deferral of taxes.
Okay.
So for some people, that's a good thing, right? I mean, it's a good thing for anybody to not pay taxes on a capital asset for 10 whole years.
But there's some inherent risk in that you don't know what the tax law will be 10 years from now, so that's part of it, right?
There is that risk. I would just say that in the history of U.S. tax law, capital gains have always been taxed. So, the risk is it's not as if you can hope that you would have had to pay taxes, and it's just you're deferring it for 10 years. So yeah,
Okay.
but you're right that there's an upside to the risk. I mean, it's conceivable that in some future year, capital gains taxation will be less than now.
Yeah.
So there is that possibility. Question?
Yes, a couple things. One, does a qualified, can a CDFI be a qualified opportunity fund?
Can it be a qualified opportunity fund? It can? Is there?
I'm thinking that theoretically it can.
Okay.
I mean, right, is that?
So there's nothing in the law that says that it cannot.
Right.
But there are more restrictions upon what it takes to qualify as a qualified opportunity fund. There are test dates of every 6 months, for example. There is a 90% asset test that says that 90% of the assets that are held by the fund have to be located in a zone that's designated.
Physical assets.
So physical we use the words tangible or intangible, but all of the above. So that if the fund is holding a piece of real estate then that real estate has to be located in the fund that in DC would have been designated by Muriel Bowser, or in Maryland or Virginia. And to the extent that the fund is going to hold intangible assets, right, so a piece of stock or a share of an LLC, an interest in an LLC or some sort of an S corp or anything like that, probably couldn't be an S corp, but that company then has to be located in the zone. So whether it's holding an intangible asset or a piece of real property, the property has to be located in the zone.
And does the zone, does the fund determine the return on investment?
The short answer is yes, but the reason I gave the analogy of hedge funds and private equity funds and mutual funds is because it is the fund's wisdom that determines the return on the investment. So in the same way that when you select a mutual fund, all you can look at is the track record. All that mutual fund can say is that if you look at our performance over the past 10 years, you can see that if you gave $100 into this fund 10 years ago, that your share of the mutual fund would now be worth $200. But no mutual fund manager is going to swear in blood and etch in stone that it's going to be worth something on some future date, because anyone who's selling a security is going to, be concerned about that. So by the same token, there is an element of trust in the wisdom of the person who's managing the fund, because once you invest in a qualified fund, the fund then makes decisions as to what piece of property to acquire or what companies to invest in that are located in the zone, and that's always a judgment call.
And my last question, is the fund the only way that the investor can invest their capital gains money?
Is it the only way?
Yeah, in other words, if an investor gets capital gains and they want to invest in an opportunity zone, is that only through the fund that they can do that investment?
So as opposed to doing it on your own?
As opposed to doing it directly, as opposed to through the fund?
I think if I understand the question is, so what this law does is if you invest in accordance with this new law, you get these tax incentives.
Right.
Right, so you can liquidate all of your Amazon stock and then you can invest in a zone, but you're not gonna get the tax incentives that you would get if you invest in a fund.
Okay, so it's the fund that provides the tax incentive, not the actual direct investment into the zone.
Right, the tax law grants tax incentives to investors who invest in a fund.
Now, that's federal, right?
This is a federal tax situation.
So can the district provide incentives for an investor using their capital gains to invest directly?
So again, your question is, can it? So the answer is always yes, that, any city or any state can choose to do these things. But I think that we are here to discuss that this new federal statute is unique, and it is the first of its kind. If in future years states choose to provide tax incentives of their own that would mimic or follow the same tax incentives, they are welcome to do that. But I think that right now, this is sort of a uniform federal.
No, I get it.
It applies across the country.
I'm just trying to understand the advantage. So the advantage to the investor is clear.
Right.
The advantage to the business that needs investment is not clear, because that business would have to go to the fund to get their investment.
So what's not clear? That is an advantage, is it?
Well, why wouldn't the fund act like a bank?
Act like a bank in what way? You could consider it
In
a
the
bank.
way that it disposes of its investments into that business. So you have the businessman who sold their property as you described. They made $1 million. They invested that $1 million into the fund. The fund has managers. Okay. The managers determine how they're going to use that money, that $1 million that was given to them, basically.
Within the guidelines of this law.
Within
yes.
within the guidelines of the law, investing in opportunity zones.
Yes.
Understood. But at that point in time, they're almost at those managers, or that manager of that fund is almost acting like a bank choosing the criteria that they are going to use to invest in an opportunity zone community.
That's true.
So I'm saying, is there, and so the advantage to the,
Okay, so I think I see
you
where you're
understand what I'm
going.
saying?
I do. So there is an advantage in one sense, and let me try to be concise. The difference between a fund and a bank is that a bank can, and in most cases, make loans.
Right?
That's primarily what banks do. They make loans, and they want to make their money on the interest that you pay back. A fund is not allowed to make loans.
Okay.
It is expressly built into the law that a fund has to take an equity stake. Right? And not only that, but you can't bob and weave around that, and a business owner wouldn't be able to grant to a fund some sort of a debt instrument that says, I owe you this, but if I don't pay you, then this debt will convert itself into equity, and so then since I can't pay you, I will give you equity at some future point in time. That's not allowed. So right from the beginning, a fund is there to take an equity stake in businesses if it chooses to go that route, because lots of funds will probably just kind of go the real estate route, but that's not the only way. But to the extent that businesses in the zone can use capital and are willing to work with a private equity sort of an investor, as opposed to just going through all the criteria that a bank would put them through, get a return or a proceed or a dividend or a distribution, whatever the word is, depending on how you're arranged, right? If you're an LLC or a partnership, we call that a distribution. If you're a corporation, we call that a dividend. But they don't get any payout from you if you happen to be having a bad year.
How does that apply to real estate?
Well, it depends on the vehicle through which so a fund can operate a business, or they can take an equity stake in a business. So if a fund were to choose to acquire a piece of land and to develop it, and in that capacity, lease out a building and collect rents, then the fund is in a sense operating a business, and the fund makes money through the rents that it collects. To the extent that the fund has trouble finding good tenants for its building, then the fund is not going to make money, right? So that's the difference, and you might call that an advantage of working with a fund versus going to a bank. A bank is not really interested in taking ownership in your company unless something goes wrong and you don't pay them and they're trying to foreclose on you. A fund is supposed to think of you as an opportunity. It's supposed to think of you as something that they want to help, somebody that they've screened and filtered, and they say, you know what, this fund, we think, we like where you're going. We looked at your books, we think you're on an upward swing. And so it would behoove the business owners in a zone, now that this law is fully in effect, to begin to refine themselves, to begin to get their books in order, to begin to make themselves as attractive as possible, so that when they approach a fund and say, hey, if I just had $500,000, this restaurant, I could open 2 new branches. Or if I just had $500,000, we could just really make it, this would be a gold mine. I just need the capital. And if you're willing to give someone an equity stake, then the relationship you have is going to be much different than what you have with a bank, where you're asking them for a loan, and no matter how well you do, you have to make those payments.
I have more questions, but I'm sure everybody.
I mean, these are fantastic questions, and one thing I just want to highlight is that opportunity zones is like one very specific sort of tool. And, it's a tool that may make sense in some situations and may not make sense for others. I'll talk a little bit in my presentation about some of the district level incentives and other resources that are available for businesses in DC.
Do you transfer real estate into a fund without selling?
May not. The fund can receive cash.
Oh,
No, no, it cannot. But therefore, you have 180 days. So anyone who liquidates a capital asset, you have 180 days, and that's a time window that you have to then transfer those funds, those proceeds, into a fund. So that's a pretty long window, and you might use that time to shop around amongst different funds you've heard of, to make sure that that's what you want to do with the fund. But the fund can't receive investments other than cash. Correct. I think I see you, I'm gonna go here because I saw your hand.
Was able to designate up to, I think, 25% of eligible census tracts. And so what determined eligibility was family income levels and poverty levels. And so, and then the states were also able to designate up to, I think, 5% contiguous tracts.
Correct.
We actually didn't designate any contiguous tracts. We only designated tracts that fit directly the eligibility. And so, but of course, there were more tracts that were eligible than we could designate. We could only designate 25. And the reason why the boundaries are the way they are is because they're census tracts, which are a somewhat, strange geographic unit based on population to some extent. But we were able to designate 25. And so, one thing that we relied on in that process was community input. We of course looked at the data, we looked at eligibility, but we also did a public survey and reached out to ANC commissioners and asked people, how should we think about this? What should we prioritize? Are there specific tracks we should or should not designate? And this is just a screenshot of some of the concepts that we shared with people. So the red and the purple and the green were a way of just asking about priorities. What should we consider in this designation process? We thought about the types of commercial activity that different census tracts could support. We talked a little bit about the nature of this tool. It's very specifically focused on commercial enterprises, not residential. It's very specific about being an equity investment. So we looked at commercial density, we looked at land uses. The purple is kind of industrial zone land. The red are places where there are some concentrations of retail corridors, like small businesses.
Excuse me, Sharon.
Yep.
I just want to get by a show of hands, how many actually completed the survey on DMPED website for opportunity zones? You went through it, asked a series of questions, and you could rank in priority what was most important to you, whether it was industrial, retail, they had the different corridors. I saw one hand go up.
This was back in
Like
February
yeah.
2018.
Yeah, like February, okay.
Yeah. So more than a year ago. And so anyway, the other thing, the green was the east of the river. So it was kind of like, what should we think about? What should we prioritize? And the vast amount of feedback on the survey said, let's prioritize east of the river. And so that's what we did. 72% of our tracts that are designated as opportunity zones are located in Ward 7 and 8 and also east of the river. Some of the other ones that are in there, and again, all meet the eligibility requirements. But we took into account things like the types of commercial activity, how might this incentive be used, where are some DMPED projects located, because public projects go through obviously a very public vetting process, and they include things like requirements to hire locally. They include local certified business enterprise contracting requirements, and so we thought of those as ways to kind of maximize the amount of benefit that comes from investments that come through a program like this. So that's kind of how we got to this map. This map. And that, by the statute was kind of the end of the formal role for state and local governments. But, but we really wanted to think about how this tool, and again, I think it's a tool that is among many tools for economic development, how could this tool best be used to benefit our communities? And based on our understanding of it, we spent a lot of time talking with people who are thinking about using it, a lot of tax attorneys too. And our understanding of it is, at this point, is that this is a tool that could help bring new retail, new neighborhood amenities, things like fresh food grocery. We think it could capitalize businesses. I've been part of the business development team at DMPED for the last 3 years. So I talked to a lot of business owners, people who have been here for a long time, people who have just started up. One of the most common challenges we hear from is that it's hard to find capital, whether that's from, venture capitalists or a loan sometimes that's, offered on favorable terms. And so we think that there are some exciting opportunities to help operating businesses in the district. We also, businesses employ people, and so we do see there being opportunity for new jobs and new career pathways. And then this is an incentive that can be paired with other incentives, and so we do think that there's also opportunity to help it finance more affordable housing production, which, as we all know, is something that we need everywhere in the District of Columbia. So we can't just hope, though, that these things will happen. They may happen if we just kind of let it all go, but we're actively thinking about ways that we can encourage these kinds of outcomes. And so, let's see. So I'll start, just kind of walk through a few of those. So first, we created a place where, just to be kind of a clearinghouse of information, a site called opzones.dc.gov. And this is a place that has, first, like, information about the opportunity zones themselves. There's an interactive map. There's, background about how we selected the zones. There's PowerPoints and articles about what the Opportunity Zones incentive is and how it works. There's also a sign-up link where you can get updates from us by email from time to time. And then there's video and other materials from meetings and convenings that we've held. In February, we had a meeting down at the RISE Demonstration Center about how Opportunity Zones could work for operating businesses. And so there's video from those discussions available at opzones.dc.gov, and as we come across other things, we add those there as well. Another way that we're thinking about harmonizing opportunity zones with some of our local priorities is, as I started to mention earlier, thinking about our local incentives. So there are a lot of things on the books here that are aimed at bringing about the things that we need in our community. So for example, we have a supermarket tax credit. It's not the most generous credit, but if you pair that with some other things, that can maybe make some projects happen that might not otherwise happen. We have a relatively new grant program called the Neighborhood Prosperity Fund, which is actually, I think, just gearing up to issue a request for applications. This is a program that funds and provides gap funding for the commercial part of mixed-use developments, and its eligibility area is almost overlapping with every opportunity zone. And so that's another type of incentive available at the local level that comes with requirements to hire locally and contract with CDEs and go through public processes that the Opportunity Zones incentive doesn't necessarily offer on its own. So we created an incentives lookup tool where you can enter in an address, or you can click a place on the map and find out what's available at that particular location. And then there's also stuff that's not based on place, things like workforce training, funds, and I don't know if dialect is tapping into any of that, but we should probably talk about it if they're not. But these are things that help encourage companies and projects to hire locally, to help create career pathways and that sort of thing. And so this is one way that we're trying to make it easier for projects to find that. So last week, Mayor Bowser announced some new initiatives, some new efforts that we're making to align opportunity zones with our local priorities. And one of those is something that we're calling the OZ Marketplace. And so this is basically something that would allow somebody with a project, or maybe it's a business, to submit that project. It would go into some online display, and funds that are looking for projects to invest in would be able to find them there. It would also enable anybody, somebody who just lives in an opportunity zone, to see what kind of activities out there, who's trying to do what. So it offers a level of transparency for any interested stakeholder. Right now, the submission link is live, so anybody can go and submit a project if they're actively seeking opportunities of investment. But the public-facing sort of interactive piece of it is in development, and we're hoping to have that up and running in the next couple of months. The mayor also announced last week a couple of other new initiatives. One is something we're calling the OZ Community Corps, and I guess if you enjoyed what George has shared tonight, it's basically that times 100. So I think that one thing that's probably very obvious is that Opportunity Zones is a little bit complicated. We're talking about tax law and how to structure financial transactions. It helps to have a lawyer to talk through those things. If it's something that you're actually thinking about as a business owner or a property owner, is this something that makes sense? Is this something that is viable? If it is something you want to go forward with, do you have the professional sorts of service providers who can help you through that? So what we're doing is putting together a network of lawyers and probably accountants who will be available to support community development organizations, business owners, and others who are located already in opportunity zones who want to tap into that expertise. And then finally, Mayor Bowser announced that we'll be putting $24 million towards affordable housing and workforce development and small business support in opportunity zones. So we're still working through all the details of that, but that will likely include funds that support preservation of existing affordable housing in opportunity zones. It will definitely include some funds for on-the-job training and apprenticeships. So projects that agree to offer programs like that to DC residents, definitely, and possibly even a smaller sort of like neighborhood zone, a resident of an opportunity zone or the surrounding community, we'd be able to reimburse them for some of that. We're thinking through some possible hiring credits. And then on the small business front, one thing that we see being a big opportunity area for opportunity zones is that this could potentially be a tool that helps businesses that are thinking about and ready to purchase commercial property possibly do that. And so that's something that we're starting to explore with CDFIs, with others who might be able to lend some expertise to that. But we hear a lot about businesses who are interested in purchasing their own space. And we also think that there's probably ways to incent affordable commercial space in some of these developments for local businesses. So that's some of what we're working on that front. Are there any questions?
Tell me something. Do you guys, would you be interested in working, I'm already in Ward 8 off of the zone with all this stuff we have. I'm working with all the young guys. I'm trying to set, I'm trying to set all the guys up in business. These guys are business people. They can't work for nobody. And if you can do what you do, they better than bankers, they better than anything else. But you gotta have the business mindset. I was taught that, my dad taught me that, dad told me about business. That's all they need is the business mindset. They can't work for nobody. And this is what I'm trying to get. I got a couple guys go out there collect metal, make $500 a day. Simple things that we gotta get back to, because we get the shootings down there, all the guys fighting over. Because the McDonald's jobs are gone. We came as kids. We had McDonald's jobs. The kids today don't have McDonald's jobs. They're career jobs now. So all they're coming up with money is gone. So I talked to them. You see. So I understand what they want to do. If you don't have no money, change what you have. And there's ways to make money, but no one's telling you how to make money. Easy money. Especially right now, the economy we live right now, anybody can make money. Anybody. I'm telling you. People hate Donald Trump. I love it. You can make money. It's all about money. I don't care what the man do. I don't care about your personal life. But you can make money. What's the question?
Did you have a question?
No, the question is that can you guys help me get money to fund these groups that I'm trying to do cooking and business and go under an umbrella of a bigger company? I'm trying to start something big with two big companies. I live over here, the shootings and the stuff, and I'm tired of it. And I know what the problem is. Nobody, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to start getting with you guys and see if we can learn how to package to put everybody to work. Everybody sitting around, they ain't got nothing to do. People need something to do.
Yeah. Well, you know, opportunity zones may offer some opportunities there, but I think that there's, I mean, what you're describing sounds like some very entrepreneurial individuals, who, you know, might be at some point thinking about what that business could look like. Like, how do you structure a plan? And there are a lot of resources available in DC, to help people think through that. I mean, that's like the definition of somebody who can be self-starter, sort of see a path forward, but sometimes you need some advisors to help you think through what that might look
We're
like.
gonna start a clothing store, just like a little
Yeah.
rapper guy. We're trying to do something like you're talking about there. You don't hear anything, that's all I'm saying.
So we can certainly talk about some of those resources. Yeah.
Hey, Emma.
So,
It's too loud.
turn down in there.
I don't like it loud.
Okay. So,
That was too loud.
I have, there's both possibility and concern. The maximizing community benefit piece for commercial development, that's a real possibility, that shows some promise. My biggest concern actually is if you have a fund that's not even from DC,
In the office.
and they wanna invest in, I live in Ward 7, and they wanna invest here in Ward 7, or as Brooke said, in Ward 8. They don't know anything about DC, they don't know anything about the neighborhoods and the communities. And the fund invests and creates changes in that community. The first question is, do the commissioners, ANC commissioners, still have great weight with regards to those projects? The second question is, if you said that there are projects that you can submit, and then how long do those projects need to take in order for those funds to look at investing in them? So if you could address both, because I'm really worried about gentrification. I mean, it's going on like it ain't nobody's business. And this could usher in further gentrification, even as it looks like it's coming under the cover of investment into a community. And so we just have to be very careful. And what do you think the district can do to make sure that that doesn't happen, and all that investment money goes towards Walter Reed and not Marshall Heights, or not Ward 8?
Yeah, so, really good questions. You know, so one thing that I think is important, to know about opportunity zones is that, you know, this is an incentive that, it's not gonna make a project that wouldn't otherwise pencil out. So, you know, it can help increase returns on the back end, but it's not gonna come in and like fill a gap. You know, I've talked to developers and others who are like, you know, at first we were really excited about this, but then we realized like you wouldn't do a project just because you can use the benefit. It still has to be a project that works for the market, you know. And right now, like, really investors from all over can come into DC and invest. I mean, this isn't something that's you know, unique to opportunity zones. But that's why it's really, really important to understand how the development processes work, because there are places where public input is kind of built in, or where comparison to a plan is a part of the review process and that sort of thing. The other sort of market dynamic I think that we're conscious of is that right now there are many more people looking to invest than there are projects available. So because of some of the timelines of the incentive, like you know, you have a tax recognition event at the end of 2026, and you need to get in, you know, at a certain point in order to realize that, and because some of the, I mean, the regulations aren't even final. Like, we're supposed to see 2 more rounds of them, they still haven't come. Like, there's a lot of timeline issues here, so there's more projects, or I'm sorry, more money than there is projects, and so, you know, funds, like, if there aren't projects, then they can't invest.
Cause I got projects.
Yeah, so and to your question about the form, so, you know, all we've done is created a pretty simple intake process, because we actually don't want to be like brokering deals, like that's not the role of government.
Correct.
Not a role we want, but we've heard from enough people that, hey, we want to have a place where we can sort of find each other, and so what we're hoping to do is just offer up a platform that gives people, and all, not just people who would be directly involved in transactions, but like I said, community residents who may not have a project or funds to invest, but are just interested in seeing what's going on. And so the idea is that you could, you know, share some information. It's probably what, like, this is Katie from my colleague who put the form together. It's probably like 12 questions. Pretty simple, but then it would facilitate people contacting each other directly to learn more.
I just want to add a few thoughts that while the volume came in nice and strong that time. Just to sort of segue from that, keep in mind that the bigger picture here is that these transactions are entirely private, right? I mean, it's a private transaction. When you sell your house, the government does not have a whole lot to say about who you sell it to. There could be a neighbor who's mad at you because you sold your house to someone who isn't from DC or doesn't respect the neighborhood. So, although these transactions are much more complicated, at the end of the day, it's still a private transaction. And the government is not interested in brokering or applying too many filters into who gets to come into. So many of us do feel that we have sort of a healthy skepticism of outside dollars, and this word gentrification always enters the conversation, and for good reason. I would just say that the flip side of gentrification is diversification. So if you were someone who was entirely invested in sort of New Orleans right before the hurricane, well, you'd have been hit pretty hard right afterwards. If you were someone who's, if the opportunity zone sort of statute or law existed, you know, right before then, and so your fund was entirely focused on, you know, Ward 9 or something down there, then you wouldn't be very happy today. If you were entirely invested in the neighborhood right next to the Carrier plant or the Ford factory that has announced that it's going to shut down, where the whole economy is dependent upon one company that employs tens of thousands of people, then you wouldn't be very happy once they announce, because when those employers lose their jobs, then they stop eating at the restaurants and they stop shopping at the malls and they stop buying, you know. So cities like DC with mayors that have the types of resources to pull together these platforms, they're going to try to facilitate and create a platform that says we want all of the folks in America, all of the funds, no matter where they're created, to know here's a project in DC that someone has answered 12 questions about. Consider pumping money into our city, even if you're not from here, because a fund manager has to try to think in terms of my investors have given me dollars, what do I do with those dollars? If I love DC because I'm from DC and I spend every dollar that my investors give me into my fund in DC, that feels good and that looks good up to a point. But if I hear about a great opportunity in LA or Seattle or Miami, maybe I should diversify, because geographic diversification, sector diversification, all of these things will help make your fund be healthy. Of course, so we do have